Today's Locked On Bucks, we take a look at the coaching career of Doc Rivers. We made a lot of mention of a full offseason and training camp with Doc Rivers. How much of an impact has that played in his previous teams? What can we expect to see for this Bucks team coming up next season? And also an under the radar surprising injury update that we were leveled with earlier this afternoon. We'll get to that coming up on the latest Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
To Locked On Bucks, I am Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis, and we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen each and every day. It is free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can also view us on YouTube, as some of you are, with the live component of today's show. Your team every day, and today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Monopoly Go. As we got to talk about this new game, the fast-paced game that lets you team up with your friends for tournaments to unlock awesome prizes like unique stickers for trading, cool playing pieces, and hilarious emojis for taunting your friends. Download Monopoly Go, now free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. Camille, we mentioned the injury piece of it. We'll get to that a little bit later, as it was very surprising to see that news come out. And I think there's a lot of jokes that people have ready to fire off with that one. But I wanted to start this one today, as we kind of teased this a couple of days ago, taking a look at Doc Rivers and what to expect. I say year two, we've all kind of mentioned that, but it's really year one for Doc Rivers when you think about everything that he's going to have available to him this offseason. So we wanted to take a look back at the coaching career of Doc Rivers. This was actually the 25th season he was a part of as a head coach. The first one of those being a partial season, but 25 seasons now on the sideline for Doc Rivers. So took a look back at all of those stops, starting with the Orlando Magic, then the Boston Celtics, the Clippers, the 76ers, and now the Bucks, and anything that stood out from the offense or the defense. And I pulled together a chart with all of Doc's teams, the previous 24. I left off this Bucks team just because it was, such a weird year. And here's what stood out to me. So 25 seasons, 24 if we're leaving off that Bucks year. In 13 of those, he had a top 10 defense. In 13 of those, he had a top 10 offense. In 7 of them, a top 5 defense. 6 times he had a top 5 offense. But really, the first 8 years of his coaching career, I'm not going to say you can throw them out, but to me, those were, the ones that kind of bring down the rest of those numbers. In year 9, that's when his Celtics won the NBA championship, beating the Lakers in 6 games. In the previous 8 seasons, the first 8 of his career, he made the playoffs 3 times and lost in the first round in each of those series. But in fairness, he wasn't expected to win any of those series. So it was really starting with that title year with the Celtics, where these numbers that we talked about, the top 10 and the top 5 ratings, both offensively and defensively, that's when they all occurred. So in the final 16 years that Doc was a head coach, that's where you saw that 13 times out of those 16 years. Top 10 defense, same with the offense. And to me, that's the big thing to point to is the defense, because we've heard him talk about this over and over during the season and initially in his end of season press conference as well, repeatedly hammering home, you can't win in this league, at least to the levels that we want to get to, with a defense that isn't good. He cited a top 10 defense. That's really the foundation of what we've seen from Doc Rivers. Even recently, he's had some nice offensive teams, but for the most part, those Clippers teams had pretty good offense. When the defense wasn't there, they weren't a very good team, losing to the Warriors just as they were becoming the Golden State Warriors, losing in the first round to the Jazz, losing in the first round to Damian Lillard's Portland Trailblazers as well. And those were all teams that were outside of the top 10. And in the case of one of those years, in the bottom 10 defensively. When he's had a good defense, and he had that in Philadelphia, that's when we've seen his team at least reach the semifinals and go further in those years with the Boston Celtics. So I look at all that and say, look, I get where he's coming from because, we've talked about how good does your defense need to be, but Doc Rivers himself has experienced that. When he's had a good defense, his team's been pretty good.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you went and dug through those numbers and framed it in that way because it's really interesting to look at with that lens, right? Because most people, first of all, I don't think they normally think of him as the coach of the Magic. They just normally jump to those Celtics years, which I get. I get it. And even with those Celtics teams, to your point of like how the first 9 or so years of his career kind of bring down the average, like you look at when he got to the Celtics in '04. Right. The first 3 seasons he had with them were really up and down. Like, I remember people saying, like, he should be fired back in, like, '06 from that particular job, and you look at it, and they were, like, a bottom third defense throughout that time, and they also weren't a good offense. Like, those early Celtics teams just weren't that good, and then you see that championship year where they had their first in net rating. Like, they had a top 10 offense and a top 5 defense, best defense in the league that year. Like, the last was it 7 seasons there in Boston while he was there, they were a top 7 defense according to Cleaning the Glass there. So like you mentioned, defense has been a driving force behind some of his better teams. And then you look at like those Clippers teams, and there were 2 years in there where the defense was not top 10, but they were sustained a bit by having a top 10 offense during those years as well. And then you look at Philly, which those numbers surprised me, I guess, because, when you're focusing on the Bucks and how we feel about Philly sometimes. You're always like, it's fool's gold in Philly, this so on and so forth. But what they were doing during the regular season in those 3 years with Doc, like they were putting up some really good numbers, top 10 defensively for the most part. I think in 2021-22, he was 11th in defense. So they just missed that top 10 mark, but they were top in the league in offense as well last year in particular, where they had a top 10 defense and a top 5 offense. Like, defense is something that Doc has talked about with this particular Bucks team, and looking at the track record of some of his better teams and seeing how good they were defensively is really interesting. And it also makes you kind of wonder and think about like, okay, what components of those teams made a good defense? Like, the defenses all did not play the same way across these 3 different franchises. So it'll be really interesting to see what he can do with full planning in this offseason for this Bucks team, especially if you're bringing back Brook Lopez with Giannis as well. What does that defense look like for this team? How do you anchor it? What do you do to try to get the Bucks to be a consistent top 10 defense going forward next year? Because as we've seen in this playoffs as well, like when defense is really good, like it's game changing. Like we talked a bit about the Minnesota game, I think might have been off air when we discussed it, but just watching this, how they swarmed, and again, in a different way than what we've seen other teams do before as well with their 3 bigs. But the defense is going to be a big piece of the puzzle for the Bucks next season.
And actually, there was one of those years, I think I said 3, it was actually 4 years in those first 8 years that they made the playoffs, but there was 1 year where they would have been expected to win as the 3 seed, and that's when they lost to the Indiana Pacers. That was a very interesting series, and that was one of the years that prompted a lot of change that we've seen in just trades and everything else in the league. Because if you remember, actually, I don't know how much of it you remember, Camille. I'm older than you are, but that year the Celtics traded Gary Payton to the Hawks, and that's how they got why can't I think of his name now? That was the trade that netted them. Boy, I'm really blanking. Great radio segment here, but nonetheless, the trade sent Gary Payton out of town. The Hawks waived Gary Payton immediately. Antoine Walker was the name I couldn't think of. That's how the Celtics got Antoine Walker. Hawks waived Gary Payton, and then Gary Payton promptly re-signed with the Celtics, which you're no longer able to do. But that was one of the series where the Celtics were the higher seed and expected to win. They lost in 7 games, and I think any Celtics fan still has that in their craw and will tell you, man, that was not a great game 6 and 7 from Paul Pierce, and that's really the reason why we lost that series. But yeah, it was minimized expectations for Doc Rivers early on in his career. And that, we remember well as Bucks fans. His second year, I believe it was, in Orlando, leading the Magic into the playoffs and taking a game off the Bucks in that first round series behind Tracy McGrady. Really, that was when he won Coach of the Year and prompted a big turnaround for the Orlando Magic. But they were a 7th seed that year. They were, I think, an 8 seed the year after that, a 6 seed, I believe, and then the 3 seed as the Celtics. So it was very, very low expectations through those first 8 years. And, I think the other part that people will tend to point to is something we'll get into quite a bit here on the other half of the break, is the whole but that's attached to it. The first 8 years, they were kind of the plucky underdog teams that Doc Rivers was coaching. And what changed in that 2008 year when they won the championship?
A big trade.
They became the big trades that they made. And those were the kind of teams that Doc really attached himself to later on, which, we've had that conversation with Phil Jackson and other coaches. It's kind of the chicken and the egg theory. But I think there are some big takeaways from Doc Rivers and what we've seen, especially defensively throughout his coaching career, and some things we can look at for the Bucks coming into this offseason here. So we'll take a look at some more of those numbers defensively. Camille mentioned some of those names too. And look, it's great to point out, here's what they did. How can the Bucks apply this going forward? And what changes would you need to see maybe in the front court or back court defensively with personnel for the Bucks to carry over some of those? So we'll get into that conversation coming up here after the break on Locked On Bucks. Well, this next segment of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Yahoo Finance. When it comes to your financial future, you think you've done it all. You've saved, you've researched, you've invested all that you can. Now you need to take those investments to the next level by using what every financial great uses: Yahoo Finance. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or you're looking for that extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data you need in one place. They are the #1 finance destination, producing a holistic look at the financial news cycle, including breaking news, original editorial perspectives, analyst ratings, independent research, customizable charts, and so much more. Securely link your brokerage accounts for a unified view of your wealth, including 401k and other investments. A comprehensive perspective is what sets apart great investors, and it is how Yahoo Finance ensures you have the insight to look at your wealth in its entirety. With a community of over 90 million users each month, their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com, the #1 financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. And if you find yourself constantly reaching for the remote to turn down the volume due to all that screaming you're hearing on Fox Sports or ESPN, we have a solution for you. It is Yahoo Sports Today, a free 24/7 Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to cover the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So I think, look, it's not breaking news to any of us to suggest, hey, if the Bucks want to turn things around, their defense is going to have to be good. We've kind of talked about this, and I think we can have more detailed conversations on this in the coming weeks once we start to get a better idea of how this roster is going to look, Camille. But, especially as we record this moments after the New York Knicks just took down the Indiana Pacers, when you watch that game and you watch the way the Knicks play, I think if we're not there already, we're moving towards a spot where the reality is Giannis probably has to be your 5 for maybe not your starter and the duration of the game, but at least for the most important stretches. We've seen that in closing time, but I think we're moving closer and closer to, well, this is just the way that you're going to have to play. So that's certainly going to be one thing that the Bucks are juggling with. And look, the other big piece of it is, I think we heard Doc Rivers talk about this. We heard Chris Middleton talk about it. And we've heard Giannis through the years talk about it when asked, can you keep playing the style that you play with Brook Lopez as your 5? It's not meant as an attack on Brook Lopez. We both love him, but just where the game is headed. Can you keep playing this way? And it was shot down by everybody, by Doc Rivers, by Chris Middleton after game 6. But, the big piece of it, if we want to remove any editorializing that any fans in the chats are going to do when you bring up the name Brook Lopez, is the age in the contract that, you're going to have to start to prepare for life after Brook Lopez. You can look at, well, who do you bring in to replace him? And I think we've gone through that exercise for years of, what about this center? I just saw on the Bucks subreddit, people suggesting, Isaiah Hartenstein is a restricted free agent. I'd love to have him. Look, I would too. There is no chance you're prying him away from the Knicks, and you're especially not getting him in a trade. But I think the answer has kind of been in front of us all along, and that is not, you're going out to secure another center out there to replace Brook Lopez. The answer is in all likelihood, you are replacing him with Giannis, and then who plays the 4? That's what you're examining of replacements.
Yeah, and the thing with that's so, I don't want to say maybe tricky, is thinking about that, because I remember the year when Brook was hurt and Giannis was forced to play a lot at the 5, and he kind of bemoaned the fact of playing the 5 consistently, how much banging that is on your body to be the consistent center. And he's like, I miss Brook being out there to kind of help shoulder that load a little bit more. And thinking about that context of it and what comes at playing the 5, and thinking about his postseason comments here in the X interview, like, maybe I have to change the way I play a little bit. I don't know how true that's going to be for Giannis and what he attempts to do in the offseason to tweak his game to try to help with the health of his body. But the idea of him playing the 5 seems like it might be counterintuitive to that, at least playing 5 for extended periods of time. At the very least, I agree with you. Like, I thought about that in the Pacers series, where I was like, this would be a perfect series to go Giannis at the 5, go small, and you switch everything. You use that speed around that. And with Brook Lopez, we've talked about it before as well, but if you don't have a good point of attack defenders when you're playing in drop coverage, it's going to make everything look a lot worse than what it really is, because now you're putting your big in a situation where they have to try to be in 2 places at once consistently. Like, every so often you might get a play where it's like, okay, I got to be in 2 places at once. I need to respond. Let me do it. But when that's the situation the entire game, you're just at an inherent disadvantage as it is. And on top of that, a lot of teams are getting better at shooting those floaters, those mid-range. You're seeing a lot more guys being effective on pull-up jumpers in the league now than what it was even 5 years ago. So the amount of people who can exploit drop coverage is starting to increase. So that's another piece of it as well, where it's like, okay, if you're seeing more offensive players being more gifted and having more talent at scoring in the in-between range, which is in a drop coverage, generally your weak spot, what can you do about that? Which goes back again to your point of attack defenders, because if you're strong there, it helps out the rest of the defense. Because at the very least, you're funneling the guy to the right place on the floor where you don't have to force your big to be in 2 places at once. So next season, I definitely would love to see more Giannis at 5, but I just don't know if him at the 5 for a long-term, role, is going to be in the cards for him. Like, I know Giannis talks about doing whatever it is for the team, and I don't doubt that at all. And you might expect, as he continues to age, it's a natural progression for him to kind of just move into that slot. But I do wonder what that would mean for, like, the health of his body as well, of just keeping up for a whole season.
That's always been the challenge, is the wear and tear it's going to put on you. And I've kind of long said, I'm not a proponent of Giannis playing the 5 for 82 games. But we may just be moving there again with the roster constraints that the Bucks have, or what they're up against, I should say. And, we've seen a few of the comments in this show during the playoffs too. I think a lot of times Brook Lopez gets unfairly maligned by Bucks fans and by basketball fans in
I would
general,
agree.
because of that point you just made, that it's it's point of attack defense. Is he a mobile switchable 5? No, he never has been. And no one is suggesting he is, or that's his strength. I understand that's where most of the league has moved to in playing defensively. It worked with Brook Lopez when you had Drew Holiday. And it's not just Drew either, Camille. As we talked about, somebody was just talking to me the other day about, man, how did the Bucks defense drop off so much? And, was it just Drew Holiday? And
No.
the answer is no. It's not just Drew. I mean, you think back to Wesley Matthews. While it was a sub-zero that he was giving you offensively, basically, that was not the case defensively. And when you think about that was your backcourt, you were going to be limited offensively, especially in the half court, as we saw in the postseason. But that was not going to be the case defensively. So you had very strong individual and team defenders on the perimeter that were assignment sure, that weren't getting beat at the point of attack, and that knew how to funnel into Brook Lopez to clean all of that up. So,
I mean, even you mentioned Wes Matthews, but also thinking about like George Hill, backup point guard, thinking about Javon Carter. Like you had some defensive minded guys who were coming in. Like the offense might have been a question, but the defense wasn't.
Everybody's favorite too, who we saw tonight, Dante DiVincenzo. I mean, you had much stronger defenders out there. So that was a big piece of it. I just think it was a team that, we've had this conversation thousands of times, but after those first 4 games, there was a lot of confusion, and I think there was probably a lot of mistrust. And I keep going back to one of those comments that Bud shared with a handful of us a year or two ago, in that, the moment that these guys pointing to the players don't think you know what you're talking about or think they know more than you do, it's over. That there's no coming back from that. And it's hard not to think that's what we saw after those first 4 games, where the team had to say, hey, we should play Brook back here. We should do some of these things. And when that happens, when the inmates are running the asylum, for lack of a better phrase, it doesn't tend to work out well. So the Bucks are always kind of behind the 8 ball. And I think that's a big piece of what we saw just kind of transfer into the season, or through the rest of the season here. So, look, we started kind of talking about Doc Rivers and his career. And I think the one other interesting thing to point out about Doc's career is I haven't done a deep dive into the whys, but by the numbers, Doc Rivers' teams have been very good, especially defensively, his first year there. The second year, we see some pretty big regression. You go back to Boston, they were in the top 15, top half of the league in defense. They were a top 10 offense. His second year, they dropped to nearly 20th offensively. They were 20th defensively. Then you go to the Clippers. They were in the top 10 defense. They were the best offense in the league. The offense stayed number 1 in year 2. Defense dropped down to the lower half of the league. And with Philly, 13th in offense, 2nd in defense. They stayed about the same offensively, dropped down to 12th defensively. It was his final year in Philly where everything seemingly clicked, and they were in the top 10 in both of those areas. So that's been the interesting caveat. I would counter with, well, I think next year is technically going to be year number 1 for Doc Rivers. So I think that's where you will see the immediate jump for this team.
Yeah, this half of season is kind of like, I think we said like the audit year, where it's like, okay, like I kind of came in, got a little head jump on what the next season is going to look like. But again, coming into a team where you don't have a training camp, where you don't have time to really implement your system, where everything's on the fly, you don't have your coaching staff, like it was a suboptimal situation to walk into and really try to put your imprint on what this team is going to be under yourself. Like we saw the makings of what the Doc Rivers Milwaukee Bucks will look like, but we never really got to see the full clear picture of it throughout the season. In addition to those logistic challenges they had, they also had the injury misfortunes happen while he was at the Rams as the head coach here for the Bucks. So I agree. I think this next season coming up is going to be the one where you're looking like this is the first like true year of Doc Rivers. Like, and we saw some things throughout the, 35 games or whatever it was that he had in the regular season here with the team that you're like, I can see the direction that you're looking to go into. But is that going to be the same direction when you have a full offseason? Or is this something that you just kind of had to do in the meantime, in between time, kind of, as we mentioned, the low hanging fruit, clean this up, and then just focus on cleaning up and not even really implementing what you want to do. So I agree with you when you're talking about what this season looked like and how next year I really do see as like the true first year with Doc Rivers as the head coach.
A lot of that's going to have to do with the roster. And again, these are conversations we will get into in much more detail as we get further along into the offseason and have a better idea of what to expect and what this team is going to look like. We're also going to get into some individual shows for some of those guys, especially the young players that you would figure the Bucks are going to have to lean on, or at least see some pretty linear progression from next season. And AJ Green, Andre Jackson, Marjan, and my guy, Chris Livingston. So we'll take some individual looks at them as well. And of course, get into everything you need to know for free agency and the draft as we move closer to those. I mentioned there was some injury news, though, nothing to laugh at, but I think it caught all of us off guard. So we'll get you up to speed on that and fill you in on what happened earlier tonight in those NBA playoffs. We will do that in the final segment of the show coming up after this on Locked On Bucks. All right, game off as we have to pause here to talk some more about Monopoly Go. I know what you're saying. Flag on the play. You guys already talked about that, but there's just so many good things in this game to discuss. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for timed tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. And there's so much more to get. You have unique stickers. You can trade those with friends to complete albums for big prizes. There are cool new playing pieces that you can travel the boards with, and hilarious emojis you can use for taunting your friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day because there are constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their own unique mini games like digging for treasure or a robot pachinko machine. And there's always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There is always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and go download it now. Free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. And shouts to all of our everydayers that are continuing to stick there with us here in the off season and out there in the live show as well in the comments. It's always a bummer to be watching playoff basketball and not seeing the Bucks a part of that, especially when earlier tonight, Camille, we were watching the team that beat the Bucks in the second round. And I know it's Locked On Bucks. I don't want to divert too much, but what have been your takeaways from this series, albeit just 2 games, but 2 games into this series with the Knicks? These have been very good games. I don't want to sound like a poor sport here, but I had some serious questions about this Pacers team, even after beating the Bucks, and wondered, I don't know how good they are and how much of it was injuries. They outplayed the Bucks, but how much of that was injuries? When I watched this series, I don't know. Maybe the Pacers are better than we gave them credit for.
Oh, I thought that you were going to tell me you've been at home screaming at your TV, like, expose these frauds to the Knicks or something like that. But no, I mean, that's something I think the Pacers are a bit better than some have given them credit for. Like, even going into that series, it was very widely just expected for the Knicks to win the series. And I was seeing that and I was like, are we sleeping on the Pacers a little bit too much in this series, not giving them the proper respect? And I think part of it was Tyrese Halliburton and not knowing his injury status as well. We saw tonight game 2 had a much better game, at least in the first half. Second half, wasn't able to get as much offense off. But what stood out to me is we've had the conversations about resting guys and so on and so forth. And we always make jokes about Tom Thibodeau coach teams like they're just going to play. They're going to get big minutes. Josh Hart doesn't even know what a bench looks like anymore at this point. And that's what stood out to me, because when I saw Jalen Brunson get hurt, I was like, okay, like the Knicks don't have Brunson, like that changes the equation big time for them. So like you got to hope that he's okay. And then you see OG pull like his hamstring towards the end of the game as well, and you're like, these injuries are starting to pile up. They're already without Mitchell Robinson. So my mind went to, are the Pacers going to be in a position again where you can only play who's in front of you? So that is what it is, but you just so happen to run into a team not at full strength, missing some key guys, and how will that help? But the Knicks being able to maintain home court advantage and win both of those games were huge for them coming out, especially with the injuries that they're facing right now.
I'm also old enough to remember growing up with the Knicks Pacers playoff series, and obviously the one memorable one, the Reggie Miller barrage that he had in the close of that game. So in some sense, it's all right. I get to see Knicks Pacers again. Also, the Pacers have worn I think it's their icon jerseys, the yellow, every single game this playoffs, all 8 games. So
I don't know what that is.
I don't know what that is, as we saw the Pacers and Bucks wear the same jerseys for every game in their series, and now the Pacers have worn those yellow ones in each of these 2 games. But yeah, that's going to be the interesting thing, and the easy spot to pile on the Pacers is what's the status for OG Anunoby and for Jalen Brunson in Game 3 as it shifts back to Indiana. But yeah, I again, they beat you, so you can't lean on the coulda, woulda, shoulda. You have to give credit to the Indiana Pacers. I had very low expectations for them in this series, and it's forced me, and I'm sure many others, to kind of reevaluate. Maybe this Pacers team is actually better than we gave them credit for. Not so much defensively, as we saw more of those flaws tonight, but especially on the offensive end of things. Speaking of offense and defense and energy, the pace that the Pacers play at, you think of that energy with Thanasis. And that was the injury news that came out earlier today. Thanasis with an Achilles injury. I think it was a ruptured Achilles, right? I don't know how or when this happened. I'm sure there are a lot of jokes to be made out there of, did he donate the Achilles to Giannis? Was that injury more severe than we thought? But Thanasis with a very, very rare this early into the offseason injury. And I mean, look, we touched on this towards the end of a show earlier this week. It's tough for Thanasis because he's a free agent. And there's always going to be the pushback of, you're going to move on from Thanasis. Why is he taking up a roster spot? We went over that with it. It's the 15th spot. You can't overlook Thanasis as a teammate, all of those things. But it's unfortunate because he is a pending free agent, especially not pending, he is. But where the Bucks are with their roster, filling it out, cap situation, I don't know if you're going to give him the veterans minimum to stick around to rehab. Maybe they do. Maybe that's part of the Giannis package, but that complicates things. And, also Thanasis is older, and there were rumblings too of maybe, he's carved out his own niche in the podcasting sphere, and he's starting to move on to media. Maybe he's ready to move on from the game and do that. So injuries like this, they're very tough to come back from. We've seen a number of athletes deal with the Achilles late in their career. It is never a given that you're going to come back and certainly be the same, but come back at all. So best wishes to Thanasis on a speedy recovery, but very, very unfortunate news to hear earlier today.
Yeah, you never want to hear about somebody rupturing their Achilles. You don't want to hear about Achilles injuries, because in your mind, you automatically think like that's almost like a year out. Like you're like, that's a season missed for the most part. And for Thanasis, he happens to have an Achilles injury at a very interesting time because he's entering free agency. And I think back to last year before he signed back with Milwaukee on the 1-year deal, where he mentioned he was thinking about leaving to go somewhere to have an opportunity to play. And there were jokes about that at that time as well. But like we mentioned about what Thanasis brings to a team, he is a great end of the bench rotational guy in that sense, because he's going to bring the energy, he's going to be consistent, he's going to be a good teammate. So now you're in a position where you have a very severe injury right before you're looking to sign with another team. So I don't know what the summer looks like for Thanasis and what that means for the Bucks as well. But we'll have to see. But like you said, more than anything, just wishing him well, wishing a speedy recovery, wishing a full recovery on Thanasis as well as he tries to come back from this injury.
Cue the jokes of the Knicks or the Lakers or the Heat about to sign Thanasis to get the inside leg on eventually bringing Giannis into town. As I'm sure we'll start to hear that, but yeah, very surprising news and unfortunate news for TA because as you mentioned, you suffer an Achilles injury at this point on the calendar. It is all but a given. You are not playing at all next season. So now he's right back in the same spot and a year older next off season. There are questions about off season in general and free agency discourse, trades, all of that. We are going to get into that to answer some of those questions. Now is not necessarily the time for it. We also need a lot more clarity on what happens across the league to have a better gauge on who is going to be available. Granted, what the Bucks have to give is very, very limited. But there's still a lot of interesting things out there, Camille. I mean, you think about this postseason is so fascinating because it seems like this has the potential to be the playoffs that was the full-on changing of the guard. It has been a lot of youth served in this postseason. What the Oklahoma City Thunder did throughout the season as the 1 seed, and now winning game 1 against the Dallas Mavericks. Luka Doncic doesn't look healthy, and that doesn't bode well for the Mavericks. So we could be looking at an Oklahoma City Thunder, Minnesota Timberwolves conference finals in the West. I think it's safe to say we can pen in the Boston Celtics on one half of the bracket in the Eastern Conference. But I mean, look, to your point, maybe the Pacers, especially if those injuries are there, the Pacers could very well be the 2021 Atlanta Hawks. And that's the team that you look up and think, man, that team reached the conference finals. So we've seen a lot of new faces and a lot of youth out there in this postseason. And I make that point when I say we have to wait for the playoffs to end, if for no other reason than what it means for some of these teams. You know, like we thought, let's go back 12 months ago. I think everybody was talking themselves into, well, Denver's here to stay. Denver is going to start to build a dynasty with the way that their roster is situated. What if the Denver Nuggets get swept by the Minnesota Timberwolves? And then all of a sudden that becomes more of a, are we sure about this? So that's how much things can change year to year and series to series. So that's why we say we got to wait for the playoffs to end just to get a better sense on who might be available and what teams are going to have to say, look, this didn't work. We got to do something differently. So those are some of the questions that need to be answered before you can really get into projecting what the offseason is going to bring.
Yeah, and really quick before we get out of here, just thinking about you bringing that up with the Nuggets, like if the Nuggets do so happen to lose this series against the Timberwolves, I talked about this on Tech File earlier, but if anybody wins besides Denver, we're going to have our 6 different NBA champion in 6 seasons. And that's something that hasn't happened in the NBA since the 70s. Like the level of parity, like just how many teams are in a position right now where they're like, we're here for the championship. And you're seeing how it's switching year after year after year here. So like if Denver doesn't win it, another new champion here, like it's interesting what that sets up as well, because there are so many teams that think they're really close to being a championship contending team. So to your point about waiting until the playoffs are over, it's going, people need to see how these teams flamed out. And then they're going to have to do a reevaluation of who's on their team and what actually works around the pieces that they want to build around. So it's going to be a lot to take a look at once the playoffs end here, especially if the Denver Nuggets do not find a way to come back in this series, which feels kind of unlike losing 2 at home off bat. I don't know.
The way they did too, losing 2 at home and losing 2 at home, especially game 2, the way that they did. I'm not ready to speak in absolutes yet, but it's starting to feel like the Minnesota Timberwolves have that look. And sometimes you arrive on the scene earlier than anticipated. We see it's just there, right? And it is starting to get that stench around the Minnesota Timberwolves. So so those are the things we need to see shake out here before we can really start to dig into the offseason. And you mentioned the potential for 6 different champions in 6 years. You know, I heard a very prominent podcaster earlier today on his recent show, basically saying, none of the previous 5 champions, it wasn't really legitimate titles, except for the Warriors juggernaut and, ironically enough, the Boston Celtics in 2008. So we may be headed there once more. We've got a lot that we've planned and are still starting to finalize for this upcoming offseason, which again is unfortunately long, that we have 5 months to start to preview the next season for the Bucks. But I think we're going to have some guests on. And as I mentioned, we're going to take a look at players on an individual basis, especially those young guys, and what we can expect in terms of their development, what role they could potentially fill for this Bucks team, especially once we get past the draft process and free agency and start to get a better hold of what this Bucks roster is going to look like. And we're still sorting through one of the ideas that you had, Camille, to try to mix things up a little bit here in the offseason and take a look back at some previous events and teams and et cetera. So a lot coming up here, not just Camille and I bantering about the games that were played in the playoffs that didn't include the Bucks and plowing over the same piece of grass, for 5 months here. So we do have a lot in store for this upcoming offseason. And I think I hesitate. Look, I'm not going to say it's going to happen, but I think we all kind of felt pretty good that if the Bucks were in the conference finals, we were definitely going to revisit the event that we did a year ago over the summer at Broken Bat Brewery. I do know at least one of our compadres is itching to do that once more. So no promises, but we are trying to work out some logistics to see if we can get all parties back into Wisconsin and do another one of those events this summer, considering we got nothing but time to put it on. So all of that, as we mentioned, a lot that we're finalizing and getting to, but a lot to look forward to this offseason here on Locked On Bucks. We'll be back once again with another show tomorrow. And speaking of those Minnesota Timberwolves, that is going to be the game when we're previewing that next show, tomorrow's show. They will be playing that night, game 3, to see if they'll go up 3-0. And again, if that happens, then the postseason becomes very, very interesting for all teams. If we do start to see maybe this is the youth movement and changing of the guard, and what does that mean for all teams? Because the last point I'll make here, Camille, and we kind of joked about, man, I don't know how long we're going to be able to go. And yet here we are approaching 45 minutes again. Look, I know we're a long way from getting there. If the Timberwolves or the Oklahoma City Thunder win the championship, or at least get to the finals, I think you're going to see a lot of teams. We've had these conversations about the Bucks, but I think you are going to see a lot of teams start to say what we have said for the last 3 years. Got to reshape this. We got to get younger. We got to get more athletic. So that's going to be even more of a challenge. It's not just going to be the Bucks saying, hey, how do we trade up from this to this? I think that is going to be a league-wide referendum, and it may already be there, but especially if one of those two teams breaks through.
Absolutely. Because everybody's watching the same thing. Like, everybody's seeing what's happening. So everybody's probably getting the same ideas. Like, it's a copycat league. We saw that when the Warriors had their dominance and everybody thought the answer was everybody needed to have a small ball lineup. Like, that was what everybody was trying to do. So if you're seeing whatever the trend is in the league and you're like, okay, we need to lean more on some young guys, like, I also do wonder what that will do to the free agency market as well. Like, if people are all trying to get younger and more athletic, what do some of the contracts for some of those older vets start to look like? Like, do we see more vet minimums? Do we see more young guys get an opportunity? Like, it's going to be really interesting to take a look at.
All right, we will be back once again tomorrow to lead you into the weekend. For Camille, I'm Justin. Thanks to everybody for tuning in to Locked On Bucks.